Hello and welcome to Bible Apologetics. My name is Pastor John. I pastor the Orion-Oxford, Repeal, and Otter Lake Seventh-day Adventist churches. And what I do periodically is I present a Bible apologetic where we discuss a doctrine that maybe somebody else has a different perspective than what we do as a church, as an Adventist church. In this case, we're going to be looking at the idea of whether or not Jesus cleansed all foods. Did he cancel or repeal the dietary laws? Now, you may not be familiar with what the dietary laws are, so I'm just going to give you just a quick overview. Basically, it comes down to the diet that God had intended for humanity. In the very beginning, God intended for humanity to live on nuts and grains. Later on, vegetation or vegetables were introduced. And then at the time of Noah's flood, because there was no availability for vegetation, then God made provisions for animal consumption. Most assume that the animals came into Noah's ark two by two, so male and female of each species. But in reality, it was the unclean animals that came in two by two, and the clean animals came in by sevens. And the reason for that is because some of them were going to be consumed in order for the humanity to survive the flood, and also some of them were going to be utilized for sacrifice. Now, as it relates to animals being clean or unclean, I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding there. What this means is simply what is safe for consumption, and God has designated to humanity what is safe and what isn't safe. You can find a list of animal products that God does not want us to consume, like pig, for example, catfish, lobster, things like that. You can find this list in Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14. The purpose for Bible apologetics is not to pat ourselves on the back to disprove someone else or to even win an argument. That's not the point at all. The point of this program is to teach people how to extract the meaning of the text, free from any biases or preconceived notions. So this is why this is so important. The topic that we're looking at today is, did Jesus cleanse all food? Is the vehicle by which we're going to be applying those biblical approaches to Bible interpretation. So that's what the whole point is, and so I'm hoping that you will enjoy this. The video that I'm going to be drawing from is from a ministry called Biblical Roots Ministries, and the gentleman in the video does an excellent job of drawing his conclusions that Jesus did repeal the dietary laws and that Christians are no longer bound to those dietary restrictions that were implemented in the Old Testament times. I happen to disagree with that, but that's okay. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I would like to show you from the scriptures, and we'll extract the meaning that the scriptures actually intended. So this is what we're going to be looking at. Did Jesus repeal the dietary laws? We're going to be focusing on Mark chapter 7, but focused on verses 18 and 19. Now, I don't have time to go over the entire context of the chapter, so I'm going to encourage you to read that for yourself. But I'm just going to read the verses in question because this seems to be the crux of the matter for those who believe that Jesus canceled the dietary laws. And you'll understand why in a moment. Mark chapter 7, verses 18 and 19, it says this, "And he saith unto them, Are ye so without understanding also? Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats." And so I just want to highlight for you, this is the text in question right here. Purging all meat. So what does this mean? In newer or more modern versions of the Bible, it'll say, thus purifying all foods. And this, of course, is New King James and the modern English version. What I'd like to show you now is the NIV version, and it reads a little bit differently. And this is by far one of the more popular versions of the Bible today. Here's how it reads in the NIV version. "Are you so dull," he asks, "don't you see that nothing that enters into a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into the stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. So there it is. There's the text that we're looking for. This same text is translated in the NIV and other versions that I'm going to show you, that Jesus declared that all foods are now clean. So this is the idea that we're going to be looking at. Now, I want to show you the first excerpt from this video. And again, hats off to the producers of this video, because he does an excellent job. I really appreciate his method of interpretation. However, we differ on our approach to Scripture, which I'm going to highlight a little bit later. But it's important for me that, and this is what I do in my churches when we do these Bible apologetics, I want the person in the video to demonstrate their case first. And we'll analyze it as we go. So here's the first of the clips, and this is the interpretation of the text.
And the line in parentheses at the end of verse 19, thus he declared all foods clean, has prompted all sorts of protests from Hebrew roots teachers, because that line so clearly and plainly teaches at face value that Jesus brought the food laws to an end, which of course disproves the entire theology of Torahism. It's been the subject of countless conspiracy theories trying to explain what it means, or even challenge that the text shouldn't be there at all.
So again, here's the text in question, which would be the last portion of verse 19. And he's right to say that some have said that this text doesn't even belong in Scripture, that the fact that it's in parentheses was some type of later addition to the text and it doesn't really go there. I'm not making that case, and I'm going to demonstrate to you why I believe this should be there. However, we're going to take a look at the original text to see if it's translated properly. We'll go to that in just a moment, but I just want you to see that not every Bible version translates it this way. For example, you got the King James, the Young's Literal, and the Darby. It says purging all meats, and of course meats is Old English for food. And then the New King James and the Modern English say thus purifying all foods. And again, meats and foods are the same word. So he appeals to the English punctuation, which is very important. And you'll see in this next video that the parentheses for him plays a large role in his understanding of the text. So he's going to show 3 different translations of the Bible, and then he's going to activate the red letter option so that you could see clearly which part of the text is Jesus' words and which part of the text is Mark's commentary. So I want him to make that case, and then you'll see what he's talking about.
Let's go check out Mark 7:19 in these same translations to see how they handle that phrase. So the ESV puts that phrase in parentheses, but offers no indication that it's missing in any manuscripts. And by the way, there were no parentheses in the original Greek language, right? These are English punctuation marks, which some English translators use to help clarify the text for the reader. And if we turn on the red letter feature, we can see that they aren't part of the red letter words of Jesus. So the reason some translations put that phrase in parentheses is to make sure the reader is aware that the text is a comment from Mark, the author of the gospel, rather than the words of Jesus. Let's see what the NIV does. Okay, they also put the phrase in parentheses and offer no indication that the text is missing in some manuscripts. And how about the New King James Version? Okay, here we have no parentheses and a footnote explaining NU, which is that other Greek manuscript, sets off the final phrase as Mark's comment that Jesus has declared all foods clean. So they're acknowledging the differences between manuscripts in this footnote and informing their readers that the ESV and NIV and other translations mark that phrase in parentheses to indicate that they're the words of Mark, not Jesus.
So very interesting. I think the red letter editions of the Bible are incredibly helpful so that we can see Jesus's words. However, I would just caution the Bible interpreter, the Bible student, don't rely on the translators to indicate which are Jesus's words and which aren't. At least for me, that argument wouldn't carry a whole lot of weight. So what you have here then is an English translation, and the way it's interpreted really matters. So when it's translated, it'll come in this form, as you would see in the New International, the English Standard, the Revised Standard, and New Revised Standard, that Jesus declared all foods clean. And then you have another line of Bibles that says something a little bit different, purging all meats or purifying all foods. So the English punctuation matters quite a bit, but we need to go a little bit deeper. We need to go to the Greek grammar. We need to see what is going on in the original text. And there's a number of very important manuscripts that are available to us that we can take a look. Here, the gentleman appeals to one of the oldest Greek manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus, and he's going to demonstrate that the phrase is actually there. And again, I'm not questioning that. I'm just going to show you how to put it in its right context. But he's going to make an appeal to the original Greek here.
Katharizon, panta, ta, bromata. What does that mean? Okay, real quick Greek lesson. So grammatically, the first word of this phrase, katharizon, is functioning in this sentence as a present active participle. It's an action word. And it's nominative, masculine, and singular, which tells us that in this context, in verse 19, the word katharizon is referring to Jesus. Jesus is the one doing the action. And what did he do? What's the action? Well, this participle comes from the lexical form of katharizo, which means to cleanse. So it's telling us that Jesus cleansed or made something clean. Or if we want to use the pronoun, he cleansed. And what did he cleanse? Well, panta means all or every, and bromata means food. So Jesus cleansed or made clean all or every food. Or, as the majority of English translations render it, he declared all foods clean. So in verse 19, Mark, the author of this gospel, tells us that when Jesus taught that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, he was declaring all foods clean.
So as you can see, he makes a rather compelling argument, appealing to the original Greek manuscripts of the text. He seems to be putting together a very good argument. No question about that. So there are some strengths to his arguments, which I'm going to concede here. Number one, the word for katharizon is a verb in a participle form, and it's also in the singular and masculine. The Textus Receptus, which is where we get the versions like the King James, New King James, mostly New King James, and the Modern English Version. The only difference here is that it's in the Omicron noon, which would make it neuter. That's neither here nor there, but I just wanted to point that out. But the gentleman says that this word katharizon is at the beginning of the sentence, and that's just simply not the case. So what I'm going to show you next are the different clauses within these two verses. What you're seeing in brackets is where one clause begins and ends. Another clause begins here and ends here. This is verse 19 in its entirety, and the clause begins here and ends here. That would be your sentence structure in the original Greek. This is what it might look like if I was going to color it, just to make it stand out just a little bit more for you. So as you can see, katharizon is not at the beginning of the clause or the sentence. It's more towards the end. And this is very important. The word order is not as important as it would be in English because the Greek helps us to identify what is the subject or what is the object of the verb. And so we're going to get to that in just a moment. But next, I just want to show you the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. So what you have here is I'm going to be showing you 4 different Greek manuscripts. The Codex Sinaiticus that the gentleman showed, the Codex Vaticanus, the Westcott and Hort's Greek New Testament, and then lastly, the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, which derived from those 3 previous texts. Most modern Bible translations are derived from this text in particular. So there's just a couple of things that I want you to notice about this, and it's this phrase up here, kai lege autois. This is very important because according to other manuscripts or other Bible versions, that text or those 3 words would repeat later, and we're going to see that they don't. Kai lege autois. And so I'm going to just show you the English equivalent of the translation of each word. Now, I've organized the English words to be in the order of the original manuscript. So in other words, they may seem a little out of order, but it's just to match the Greek. We're looking at this phrase, kai lege autois. And he says, this is Jesus, this is the masculine singular verb. He says to them. Keep that in mind, put it on the shelf. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Another thing I'd like you to notice about verse 18 is this punctuation mark here. This would look like a semicolon for us English users, but that is actually a question mark in Greek. So I just want you to notice that about that. Next, we see verse 19, of course, with its translation, and you have the word katharizon right here. Katharizon panta ta bromata. No question about that. But here is a problem. The question mark in the original Greek, or in the Nestle Allen's 28th edition here, is all the way at the end of the sentence. That's significant because that seems to imply that this part of the verse was not Mark's commentary, but this was part of Jesus's discourse. But we'll see. We'll see if that's the case. But here's the word in question, katharizon, and the gentleman's parsing of the word is spot on. It is a verb. It's in the present active. It's a participle in the nominative form, and it is singular masculine. So basically, this is telling us the function of this word, what it's doing, what it's pointing out, what is the action, but it's also pointing us to the object. As I mentioned, this is in the nominative form, and this is to indicate the subject of the sentence or the predicate nominative that is actually performing the action. So this could be a person or a thing that's performing the verbal action here. So we're looking then for an accusative noun that's also in the singular and also in the masculine. So we have to go back to our text here. Remember, this is a separate clause. The direct object or the subject of this verb has to be within this clause. So let's take a look. The first noun that we find is cardion, for heart. And I want you to notice its ending. It ends with an alpha noon, which would signify that this is a noun. It is in the accusative form, but it is singular and feminine. So it's not masculine. This verb is not pointing us to a person's heart. The next noun that we're going to look at is kolion, and this is translated as belly or stomach in some versions. But you notice that it also has the same ending as cardion with the alpha noon, and this would indicate that it's the same thing. This is a noun, it's in the accusative form, and it's a singular feminine. Now, what does accusative mean? It just means that it is a direct object of the verb. So we need to look at the next noun, which would be right here, aphrodrona, and this would be for drought. Notice its ending. This would indicate that it is in the singular masculine, which would match our verb over here. It's also in the accusative form. So now we see that this verb is not pointing towards Jesus as the one purifying or purging all the food. It's pointing to this object, the drought, which would be translated as sewer, latrine, or toilet. Why Jesus uses this language, we're going to get into in just a moment. But for now, I just want you to see the Greek grammar that is behind it. You don't need to know Greek in order to understand that. But what's interesting about modern versions is that the word for drought or sewer is completely removed. So you notice, for example, in the New King James, it says that because it does not enter into his heart but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods. No mention of the sewer there. And the same thing in the NIV version. You'll notice that the absence of the aphrodrona, or the latrine, the toilet, is also absent. Without that noun, you might see how the translators would get the impression that it's actually Jesus that verb is pointing to, because he would be the only other noun that would qualify, that would be in the accusative state and also singular masculine. In the absence of the word aphrodrona, it's possible then to get the impression that it's Jesus who's actually cleansing the food. And that's why some translations have these words in red. Of course, the New King James also has that part of the verse in red, so that's something to note. The King James, the same thing. But then you get a translation like the NIV that has that last phrase in black, or indicating that this was Mark's commentary. So then the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is aphrodrona absent from the translations that we're looking at today? Well, let's take a look at a number of different Greek manuscripts, some of the major Greek manuscripts that most of our Bibles are translated from. Here's the Textus Receptus, for example, and the word for aphrodrona is there. clearly indicated there, as you can see on the screen. The Westcott and Hort Greek New Testament is also there. Aphrodrona, it's there as well. But then we look at the Codex Sinaiticus, which is where the gentleman demonstrated from his video. And by the way, I went to that same website and verified it. It's written just as he indicated. If he would have just looked a couple of words back, he would have found that Aphrodrona is there, even in the Codex Sinaiticus. And another major version of the Greek New Testament would be the Codex Vaticanus. And guess what? It's there as well. Next, I want you to see how certain translators have taken these texts. And as you can see, Aphrodrona is included in all the major texts. However, there's some discrepancies in the translation. The first one we're going to take a look at is the English Standard Version. So what I'm indicating here are words that have been omitted and some that have been added to the text. For example, we have eiston aphrodrona. Here's that word that we were considering. Notice it's absent from the English Standard Text. Also, the question mark has been moved from the end of the sentence and moved all the way over here, leaving this to be interpreted as Mark's commentary. But notice, remember I had you remember the kai lege? Well, that would be indicating he said. Well, that part, he declared, is not part of the text here. These words are in addition to the text. Panta to brahmata katharizon, no problem there. As I mentioned, katharizon doesn't have to be in this position or over here. It doesn't really matter. And so, but it's the concept is there. Next, I want you to see the NIV version. It does something very similar. And that phrase, eiston aphrodrona, again, is absent from the text. It adds words like of the body, which is implied, and so that's not necessarily an issue. But in saying this Jesus is a phrase that is an addition to the text. As you can see, it doesn't exist in any of the manuscripts. So you would be looking for kai lege autois or something like that. And then the word for Jesus in Greek, Iesus, is also absent. Declared could be part of lege there, but again, that's an addition to the text. It's not actually there. Panta to brahmata katharizon. And notice there is the question mark, of course, but it is omitted from the NIV version. A more egregious case could be found with the New Living Translation. And there's something really interesting here because the phrase for ton aphrodrona was included in their text. And it says here, the sewer, right here. There are some words that are addition, like by saying this, as I mentioned in the previous text, kai lege isn't there. And he declared isn't there either. Panta ta bromata katharizon. This word katharizon seems to be interpreted in this way, acceptable in God's eyes. And of course, God's eyes are words that are also an addition. The New Living Translation is more of a paraphrase, so you might expect for there to be some descriptive words, and that wouldn't be the Bible I would study from, but I understand why those additional words might be there. But also notice that the question mark has been omitted from the New Living Translation text as well. We get a little closer as we move now to the New King James Version. Here, eiston aphrodrona is also omitted for some reason, and I'm not understanding why. The New King James Version is primarily translated from the Textus Receptus. It's meant to be an update to the original King James Version, but in this case it differs from it significantly. Without the word aphrodrona, or in other words, without the noun that is in the accusative state and singular masculine, this verb isn't pointing to anyone else except you got to keep going further, and that would point to Jesus. But the fact is that the word is actually there. When we arrive at the King James Version, something really interesting happens here is because, as I mentioned, the Greek text that you see on the screen is from the Nestle Allen 28th edition. This was a translation that's very modern, hundreds of years before the King James Version was translated, and yet the King James Version matches this text in the Nestle Allen 28th edition, word for word, punctuation for punctuation, as you could see on the screen, including the question mark at the end of the clause. I want to dispel a couple of doubts that ultimately come up. Number one, the gentleman said, and I've heard this argument, that this part of the text doesn't belong in Scripture. I beg to differ. It is there, at least every major manuscript that I verified, it's there. The other thing is that I'm not necessarily a King James only type of pastor. I prefer the King James, but I'm not King James only. So I do like to compare other versions of the Bible. Some I give a little more weight to than others, but I primarily study from the King James version of the Bible. So, what is the point of this text? If it isn't Jesus that is doing the purification of all foods, then, and this is pointing towards the aphrodrona, in other words, the sewer or the latrine, what then is the point of this text? What is Jesus saying here? Well, he's addressing the issue that the Pharisees accused the disciples of being defiled because they didn't wash their hands. Now, I'm going to get to that in just a moment, because Jesus is making the case here that just because you didn't wash your hands doesn't mean you're actually defiled. So Jesus is giving a lesson in human anatomy in this text to make the teachings very clear for those who were attempting to be judgmental against his disciples. And again, here's the text in the King James Version. The gentleman in the video says that Jesus clearly brought all the dietary or food laws to an end. Is that what Jesus is actually saying? So we have to take a look again at aphrodrona, and in the King James is translated as drought, as you could see right there. Other versions translate it like such: drought or drain, latrine or sewer. So that word does belong there, and that's what's actually doing the cleansing. So when we see the text as thus purifying all foods, does that mean that Jesus is doing away with the dietary laws? Let's make this practical though. Was Jesus trying to teach us that the animals that were unfit for consumption are now fit for consumption? This is what we need to analyze. That's why we had to take a close look at the text. What I want you to see next is the Cleveland Clinic, and this looks like it could be a commentary on this very verse. Notice the wording here. The gastrointestinal system helps eliminate impurities in food by breaking down the food and absorbing nutrients, while waste products and toxins are processed and expelled from the body as feces. This process involves various organs, including the stomach and intestines, which work together to ensure proper digestion and waste elimination. The stomach releases acids and enzymes that break down food. Jesus, the creator of all humanity, the one who is able to prescribe what foods are healthful for us, which ones are harmful for us as well, he is letting everybody know in that scene, and us by an extension, that it is the stomach that then cleanses, what the Jews were saying defiled his disciples because they didn't wash their hands. Here's a commentary on that verse. I rather enjoyed this. It comes from the Andrews Bible Commentary. It says this: what comes from outside and goes into the person does not defile because it simply passes through. It does not reside inside the person. Jesus takes the issue of defilement to a new level. External sources of contamination pale in comparison with internal vices that darken and defile the heart. And of course, the text is talking about where Jesus then goes to the evil that's in our heart. That's what defiles us, not what goes into the mouth, but what comes from the heart and out of the mouth. That defiles the man. And so Jesus takes it much further than what the Pharisees originally intended in their judgmental attitude towards Jesus and his disciples. So next we need to figure out then. We need to make this clear. We have to come to a conclusion. Were these Jesus's words at the end of verse 19, or was it Mark's commentary? And in this last video excerpt, the gentleman makes the case that it's actually Mark that's clarifying what Jesus was teaching. And for him, it's obvious. What I would like you to do, though, for this last excerpt is to pay close attention to the method the gentleman is using to draw his conclusion. You'll notice this by his choice of words. Pay close attention, and you'll see what I mean.
So I imagine the author sitting down. Now, there's no evidence of this, it's just my imagination, but he sits down and begins to write it all out, right? He may have been taking notes from Peter, who was an eyewitness to all the things that Jesus taught. And when it comes to Yeshua's clash with the Pharisees over the washing of hands, Mark begins to write down what happened that day. And he's reflecting on this event decades later, and the things that Jesus had said that day. He wants to make sure that none of his readers miss the importance of the Lord's teaching. And he's writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he, or maybe Peter, if he was taking dictation, sensed that his readers would have the same questions that the disciples did that day. Because Jesus made a shocking declaration. So Mark adds a brief comment in the middle of the words of Jesus to clarify what Jesus was teaching. Thus he declared all foods clean. It's almost like Mark saying, yes, my Jewish readers, yes, my Hebrew roots friends, you read that correctly. Jesus declared all foods clean.
So there's the conclusion of the matter. And I don't know if you noticed his method of interpretation. And this is where we arrive at the crux of the matter. This is where we arrive at the whole point of having Bible apologetics. I'm trying to teach people how to extract the meaning of the text. There's two different ways that people read the Bible. One, they read the Bible, they take what it says, and then they incorporate it, they process it in their intellect. Another way is to begin with the preconceived notion and infuse that into the text. In other words, I'm reading into the text what I think it should say. The language that the gentleman uses here, that I'm using my imagination, there's no evidence to this, and so on and so forth, indicates that he's infusing his presuppositions into the text and not allowing the text to actually tell him what it's actually saying or what the meaning is. And so these are theological terms that we would apply here. Eisegesis is one. Eisegesis means that you're infusing your own, or you're inserting your own presupposition into the text. Exegesis, or an exegetical Bible study, means that you're drawing from the text to see what it is that God has as his message towards us. Here's where we differ. The gentleman seems to be using the eisegetical approach to Bible scripture. It seems to make a whole lot of sense. Everything that he said, as I said, he's made a strong argument for his position. However, with some scrutiny, as you have seen, it doesn't hold up. And so I'm not trying to make any judgment on the gentleman, his sincerity, or anything like that. I don't know the man at all. So I'm not making a comment on any of that. Simply that I disagree with his approach to Bible study. What we have to do then is do an exegetical Bible study and draw from the text. And when we draw from the text, we see that, as I want to show you in the, I want to go back to the original Greek here. So we're going to see here that the katharizon panta ta bromata, we have this question mark here, which would indicate that this is part of Jesus's text. So no, I do not believe that this was Mark's commentary because of that, because the clause ends all the way over here, which would make this part of Jesus's discourse. That's one. Katharizon here is pointing towards a noun that's in the masculine form, singular masculine, and there's only one, and it's aphrodrona. Now, this word has been omitted from many of the different Bible versions, including the the three that he showed in his video, and I can't find a good reason why that may be the case. Aphrodrona has been included in every major Greek manuscript. So I would have to say then that his conclusion is faulty. I wouldn't agree with it. But what then was the central issue here? What was the problem that Jesus was addressing here? And this is what we're going to take a look at next. What is the central issue here? As I mentioned to you, I'd encourage you to read the text in its context. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, but a text taken out of its context is just a pretext. You want to be able to look at the surrounding text, get a better idea for what the text is actually indicating. So in verses 1 and 2 right there in Mark chapter 7, it says this: Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes, which came from Jerusalem. And when they had saw that some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, notice, that is to say, with unwashen hands, they found fault. So that was the issue. They didn't practice the ceremonial or the ritual hand washing. And for them, that seemed to indicate that his disciples had defiled themselves because their hands may not have been exactly clean. And so Jesus then is correcting that view that eating food with unwashed hands isn't what defiles a person. And then he goes through the whole digestive system to indicate how the food is then processed. I go back to the Cleveland Clinic that says that the gastrointestinal system removes all of those impurities, which is precisely what Jesus says, that the belly or the stomach removes that food, all those impurities that may be found in the food, and then it goes out of the body and into the drought. So that system then purifies that food. So what I'd like you to see then is in Matthew's version, chapter 15, verse 20, this is an additional bit of information, and it reads like this. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. That was the core issue that these texts are indicating. So in conclusion, we see what is the actual, when you draw from the text, then we see what is the real issue. Did it have anything to do with food at all? Not really. Didn't have anything to do with any certain types of food. Didn't have anything to do with whether or not the foods that were previously deemed unclean are now suddenly clean. What that means is when they were unsafe to eat in the Old Testament times, they're still unsafe to eat today. So we're considering whether or not the animals that were deemed unsafe for human consumption are now suddenly fit for human consumption. Are they safe to eat? Pork is just as harmful in the Old Testament times as it is today. The cross didn't cleanse pork. No, Jesus died on the cross not to cleanse pork and catfish and lobster. He came to cleanse you and me, the ones who were defiled by sin. And our precious Lord and Savior went to that dreadful cross. He was nailed to that cross. He died of a broken heart. He asked for forgiveness for all mankind. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's what Jesus is concerned about. When we're enjoying some of those foods that God has deemed to be unfit, you could very easily read into the text and say, no, this is okay now. We could eat this. I guarantee you, go to the doctor and maybe go look on the Cleveland Clinic website and see what they have to say about some of these foods that the Bible has for thousands of years determined to be unfit for human consumption. Another thing to consider is that we practice a vegetarian diet as Seventh-day Adventists. And the reason why is because when the original diet was established, as I mentioned, it was nuts and grains. Well, I want you to know that when we get to heaven, there aren't going to be any slaughterhouses there either. So there are not going to be any pork chops or bacon or steaks or chicken tenders or any of that. Those animals are precious to the Lord as well. There aren't going to be any more death when we're in heaven. So something to consider. But I want you to know that God has your best interest in mind. And so I want you to understand the way, the proper way to extract the meaning of the text. And that is the way that I try to teach my congregations. You may have noticed that this is number 6 in the series, and I'm planning on dealing with part 7, which would be a continuation of this same gentleman's video where he goes over Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10. So that's what I'm planning on going to next. I would like to revisit some of the previous Bible apologetics because they're just as fascinating. And if you're interested in that, let me know. I would love to share them with you. So if I can do anything for you, please let me know. I am your humble servant. My name is Pastor John, and I pray for your journey following our Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.